Julie.
And on today's show, we are going to dive into the history of no-fault divorce. Arizona, in fact, is a no-fault divorce state. And what that means is when a husband and wife say, I want a divorce, they don't have to prove any wrongdoing by the other spouse or any wrongdoing that they themselves engaged in, because it's not an element. It's not required in order to get divorced. All you have to show in Arizona is that your marriage is irretrievably broken. And basically, one spouse just has to say that and it's done. There's no inquiry into the facts or what happened and that led to the breakup of the marriage. But it hasn't always been this way. In fact, in 1819, under the Alabama Constitution, in order to get divorced, spouses had to get the approval of a court as well as 2/3 of both houses of the state legislature.
Wow.
So imagine, Keith, being in a marriage you don't want to be in, and you literally have to get the state legislature 2/3. It's like higher than what's needed to veto, to overturn a veto by the governor. And yet that's what's required to get divorced. Can you imagine?
No, because the backlog would have been just crazy.
So that was Alabama. That was in place for years, because really it wasn't until the 1960s that things started to change in the United States judicial system. And California, in fact, was the first state in, I believe, 1969 to pass laws that brought into place the no-fault divorce. Now, believe it or not, no-fault divorce goes back to Russia in the 1910s and 1920s. That's where we see the first no-fault divorce laws enacted. And this was under the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, what happened was that they intended to revolutionize society at every level. And in 1925, at a debate of the Soviet conference to draft the family law of 1926, there was a question about whether marriages should even be registered. And the chief architect of Soviet family laws in the 1920s and 30s described the purpose of divorce without restraint as a step towards the ultimate goal of the abolition of marriage in an effort to achieve the socialist transformation of society. So, no-fault divorce came out of the Bolshevik Revolution in an effort to transform society into a socialist, utopia. And really, we can't necessarily say that when the United States adopted these laws, it was for the same intents and purposes. But what we see is that when these laws originally came into place, that was the thought process behind them. And I didn't get this information from some obscure right-wing crazy website. This was from Wikipedia.
You know, that's pretty amazing when you think about the ideology that they had in mind. How this could help and benefit their socialist movement.
Exactly. That was the whole purpose. And there was talk about, in fact, not registering marriage, abolishing marriage, with the idea being that there would be no financial or moral obligations between a man and a woman. You could have free love, you could just float between different relationships, and that would help you achieve true, pure love.
Yeah, unless you're on the other end when you've been with this person for like 15 years and he's the breadwinner, because Russia, I'm guessing the guys mainly are were at that time with the breadwinners, and just says, okay, I'm done with you, I'm going to move over here to this one and I'm just going to discard you. Well,
of course, the state was there to step in. And these no-fault divorce laws did include provisions for mandatory child support. However, there weren't really any enforcement provisions because it was presumed that the state was there to provide for everybody.
Yeah.
So, Keith, are you on board for the no-fault divorce?
for the no-fault divorce, am I on board for it? And we are, right? Arizona, like you said.
We are across the United States. And in fact, the last state to fully adopt no-fault divorce was in 2010. And that state was New York.
Wow. Well, you know, I guess the bottom line is that, yeah, I'm on board, I guess, with it. You know, I mean, but the ideal that it came from out of a socialist idea is just something I would have never thought about in a million years.
Now, in the 1960s, when the United States started, or various states within the U.S. started adopting no-fault divorce, the theory and the drive behind changing the law was not to impose some sort of socialist revolution,
right,
but it was more to preserve the integrity of the courts, because what was happening was that people were putting on basically sham testimony in order to get out of their marriages. So believe it or not, in the 30s, 40s, there were women who had full-time professions acting as the mistress, setting up a scene where the wife could, unbeknownst to her, walk into the room, see her husband with this hired mistress, and then be in a position to testify to the court that she knows that an adulterous affair went on because she saw her husband with a naked woman, or something to that effect. Right. And women actually had full-time jobs doing this. There was enough work, enough demand of people wanting to get divorced and looking for a way to justify and get their divorce through the courts, that these women could have full-time professions doing this. And it led me to wonder, I wonder if the judges became familiar with some of these women, seeing pictures or something, if,
and look at that.
Evidence was presented in that regard.
So we could say that since, we implemented no-fault divorce, it was a job cutter. People actually didn't have a job anymore.
It may have increased the workload for attorneys, though, so there was a balancing there in the long run. But the issue for the judges and the attorneys were that they were saying, look, this is a threat to the integrity of the judicial system, because we all know that this is a sham. We're just not asking that question. We're just going through a very limited set of the facts, but not asking the question of, did you know that this was going to happen? Did you agree that this would be set up and go down this way? And instead, they only asked, did you walk in the room? What did you see? Are you positive an affair was happening? Something like that. And everybody knew that it really wasn't true, genuine testimony. It was just a means to get a divorce. And judges and attorneys were concerned about that. They said, this is ridiculous. And plus, can you imagine hearing this type of testimony day in and day out?
Well, and the fact is that how it could be that, some people just fall out of love. And to have to come up with the scam, like you said, I think it just happens. I think people fall out of love and they go separate ways, they grow different, something happens.
Now, I've got a few stories.
And would you want people to stay in a marriage because it was so hard to get out of?
Well, it's what's interesting. When you get married, you enter into a contract. Believe it or not, it's a marital contract. And normally, to get out of that type of contract, there has to be some sort of justification or wrongdoing. And as a result, because, that's not here, that's how the law originally unfolded. And also this idea of having certain duties and wanting to keep the institution of marriage strong. But you're right, it doesn't always work that way.
Well, let's say you got...
And there doesn't always have to be some, major wrongdoing. People can change over time. You fall out of love. Those little things that maybe didn't bother you so much when you got married, now you just cannot deal with for one more second.
Or it just turns into a Yahoo. What happens if he just turned into a Yahoo?
Yeah,
midlife crisis. Midlife crisis time. I keep waiting for mine. That comes along.
Well, you haven't hit midlife yet, apparently.
Oh boy, I'm there. But I mean, I'm waiting for it. And any second, I know it's just going to hit me. I keep waiting. In fact, last night when I was going to bed, I was tired, so I went to bed early. I went to bed like at 8, because I was tired. Sure. And when I was laying in bed and I was wondering, I wonder when I'm going to have my midlife crisis. I even thought of it again. I mean, when I was going to sleep, just when is it going to happen? I want to be ready for it so I can, dodge it or something. I don't know.
Well, it might not be something that, you really acknowledge that easily. Who knows? But it sounds like you're going to be prepared either way.
I don't know. I've often wondered that with people. Anyway, getting back.
Yeah, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it talks, and this came out in 2010 when New York finally fully adopted the no-fault divorce laws. And it goes through some really interesting stories from the early 20th century about how all these divorce laws, the fault divorce laws, how that actually worked in the court system and what people did. And this article says that in the early 20th century, a number of women hired themselves out as correspondents in divorce cases, essentially bait for philandering husbands. In 1934, the New York Mirror published an article titled, "I Was the Unknown Blonde in 100 New York Divorces," featuring one Dorothy Jarvis who earned as much as $100 a job. Miss Jarvis had several tactics beyond taking her date to a hotel room and awaiting ambush. There was the push and raid, where she would push herself into a man's room dressed only in a fur coat, then whip off her outer garment, as well as the shadow in Shanghai and the dance and dope. There never was a shortage of juicy testimony. In the case of Cock versus Cock, great name, of 1818, an eyewitness testified that when Mr. Cock was away, he came to the house before sunrise to find Mrs. Cock in bed with another man. She was being undressed, and he was having his breeches unbuttoned and down about his feet. Likewise, in the case against Aaron Burr, the infamous founding father, a servant deposed that she had seen Jane McManus with her clothes all up and Colin Burr with his hands under them and his pantaloons down. The divorce was granted the day Mr. Burr died. Then there were those who were desperate enough to fight the law, most without success. The extraordinary case of Eunice Chapman, which drew national attention, was a rare instance of triumph. When she met her husband in Durham, New York in 1802, Eunice Hawley was a 24-year-old beauty headed towards spinsterhood thanks to her family's financial failings. She was initially put off by the advances of James Chapman, a widower 15 years her senior, as she later wrote. However, he had a good business and promised her security, and after 2 years of his dogged pursuit, Miss Hawley accepted his hand in matrimony. 8 years and 3 children later, the marriage fell apart, according to her, because of his abuse, alcoholism, and infidelity. According to him, because of her abusive tongue. Finally, James left Eunice and their children, ages 2, 5, and 6, with no plans to return. This might not have been the end of the story had James not encountered a religious society called the Shakers. Now famed for their spare, modern-looking designs, the Shakers were a radical sect that in following the teachings of their English-born leader, Anne Lee, required their followers to renounce their sexuality, all private property, and personal family bonds for a larger spiritual union. To James, the Shakers' spiritual inspiration and orderly lifestyle were just what his family needed, and he hoped that his wife would agree. Eunice did not. From there, the Chapmans became locked in a battle for the children who were, by law and culture of the times, considered rightful property of their father. Eventually, James exercised this paternal prerogative. While Eunice was out, he seized the children and brought them to the Shakers near Albany, New York. Later, when Eunice came after them, he took the children into hiding among the Shakers in New Hampshire. Eunice was now an abandoned woman with no access to her children and no secure way to rid herself of her husband, a situation made critical by the legal status of married women at the time. From the moment she wed, a woman like Eunice was considered civilly dead by law. She could not own property, earn her own wages, sue or be sued, make a will, or sign any other contract by herself. She would remain in this state until her husband died or she managed to obtain a full divorce. Years later, Eunice's opponents would complain that Eunice had plenty of recourse in the existing divorce laws since she could charge her husband with adultery. Not only did she claim to have ocular demonstration of his cheating, but she had an eyewitness who could testify that he had seen James lying in a back room with another woman. The problem was that, even with such proof, there was no guarantee that the court would take Eunice's side. This is, the guilty mind was required, and Eunice would be hard